Hi, this is my Capstone Project on torture and terrorist attacks, and specifically trying to answer the question of whether or not torture is morally justifiable in order to prevent terror attacks. A little bit of context on torture itself. The definition of torture is the act of deliberately inflicting physical or psychological pain in order to fulfill some desire or compel some action from the victim. And it's very interesting that torture actually originated within civilized societies such as Greek and Roman civilizations. And this means that the smart people, that the civilized people actually came up with these methods, not pre-civilization savages. And from the very beginning within these societies, torture was justified by completely ridiculous tactics. One test they used to determine a person's guilt was they would throw the suspect in water, and if he or she sunk, they would be claimed innocent, and if they floated, they were determined to be guilty. Another test used in Spain was the victim or the suspect had a piece of scalding iron placed in his or her hands, and after 3 days, if the wound had not healed, the person was determined to be guilty. The issue itself. In America, torture, specifically after the 9/11 terror attack, has become much more prevalent. And another issue, or another event that caused torture to become much more prevalent within American government and society is the Abu Ghraib scandal, in which hundreds of terrorist suspects were tortured within a prison in the Middle East. And this causes many to consider the question of whether or not torture can be utilized to prevent potential terrorist attacks and still be morally justifiable. Some considerations must be taken when discussing torture itself, because it is a very complex issue and there are very strong sides to each side of the argument, and both the pros and cons of the arguments must be weighed. Some of the factors that must be considered include the effect that torture and prevented terrorist attacks has on the mass population. Prevented terrorist attacks ensures the safety of possibly hundreds of people and their families, which is clearly a positive effect. The effect that it has on victims is that the torture techniques such as waterboarding, rectal feeding, or hydration, and being forced to stay awake for days results in post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, insomnia, recurring nightmares, depression, and lapses in memory. And that's not even including the physical toll that being tortured for days, weeks, months, or years even can take on the human body. There are also effects on the torturer. The person doing the torturing, he or she often finds a lack of emotion is necessary to become dehumanized in order to cope with one's actions. So basically these torturers, they dehumanize themselves and they try to regress their feelings, their emotions, in order to cope with what they're actually doing to these people. So some of the pros of torture is the prevention of terrorist attacks, the valuable information that can be attained through these methods, hundreds of American lives saved in each prevented attack, and that's best case scenario. And the so-called extra punishment for terrorists. So some people believe that it's necessary for these terrorist suspects to be pushed past their limit, to be punished beyond the law because of what they plan to do is so terrible. So this extra punishment, the torture itself. And some of the cons of torture is the permanent psychological effects on torture victims, which I listed before. Human rights are ignored, and because the Geneva Convention declared that it is a human's intrinsic right not to be tortured. And this is clearly violated in places like Guantanamo Bay, pictured below. And an estimated 20 plots have been thwarted due to these methods, which is a extremely low number considering the fact that one terrorist suspect was tortured 183 times in 1 month. And the information may be falsified by the victim because the body's natural response is to say or do anything in order to lower the pain and stress levels in the body to normal levels. And finally, it tests the limits of human malevolence. How far is one willing to go? How immoral is one willing to become in order to prevent a terrorist attack? So the idea of utilitarianism is the belief in a system wherein actions are deemed righteous if they benefit the majority. So say 30 people are happy and benefit from the suffering of one person. Those 30 people, they outweigh the suffering of the one person. And within the system, the actions of torture could be argued as righteous depending on the cause, which is to prevent terrorist attacks. So, say one terrorist is tortured and hundreds of lives are saved. So the lives of the people that could have been killed by the terrorist attack itself, and the family members or the loved ones of the potential victims. Those hundreds of lives outweigh the one life of that terror suspect who was tortured and had his or her human rights taken away. My view itself is that after observing this controversy, I still believe that the violation of one person's human rights is not morally justifiable, even if saving the lives of many others. Because say that one terrorist is brought in and they realize that he's not going to talk, or he or she is not going to talk, they begin to torture his family in front of his eyes and trying to get this information. This cannot be deemed morally justifiable. And one of my sources even argued that what if a terrorist suspect had a profound love for infants, and a whole room of infants was tortured in front of his or her eyes in order to gain information? This cannot be morally justifiable. The solution to this issue is that the people and the government of the United States, they must come to realize that torture is obviously inhumane, but it is also very ineffective. And it's been proven that non-hostile methods actually help gain more vital and accurate information than brutal torture techniques. One 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 case was when a terrorist suspect was given cookies rather than being tortured, and he then helped his interrogators find the bomb and where it was placed. An organization that is attempting to solve this issue is the World Organization Against Torture, the WOT, and it plans to prohibit torture worldwide. And it educates countries and people on the ineffectiveness and senselessness of torture, and it advocates specifically for human rights during interrogation. Not to mention, the WOT also provides care for victims of torture and the psychological effects that come with being tortured. Another solution that is needed is to change the cycle of socialization within America. A 2011 poll indicated that 51% of Americans thought that torture was morally justifiable of preventing terrorist attacks. This method of thinking has to be broken, it has to be changed, because if we teach our children that torture is morally justifiable, they will do it. And then they teach that to their children, and it will just continue. This immoral act must be changed, it must be broken within our minds, and we must be held accountable for the lives that torture can affect and completely alter. And that is why torture in itself is immoral and is not morally justifiable, even if preventing a terrorist attack. This is my works cited. Thank you for listening.